Okay, good evening. It is time to start a new book. So, decided on Thomas Sowell, Affirmative Action Around the World. So that's what I'm going to jump into. Um, there is a very short introduction, and then I'll read the first chapter. There are only 7 chapters in the whole book, so but they're relatively long. So one a night. So it'll only take a couple of weeks to get through the book. All right, let's just hop right on into it. If you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, please look him up. He is quite a man. Okay, preface. There we are. Okay, so like I said, this is fairly short. Many, if not most, people who are for or against affirmative action are for or against the theory of affirmative action. The factual question of what actually happens as a result of affirmative action policies receives remarkably little attention. Assumptions, beliefs, and rationales dominate controversies on this issue in countries around the world. This book addresses the empirical question of just what does and does not happen under affirmative action, and to whose benefit and whose detriment. Even an observer highly sympathetic to affirmative action in Malaysia noted in passing, quote, new policies were often put forth without considering what the success or failure of past policies boded for their own prospects, end quote. This was not unique to Malaysia. It has been the rule rather than the exception in many countries with affirmative action policies, as well as with other policies. The purpose of this book is to consider the actual consequences of affirmative action. The experience of more than 30 years of researching and analyzing affirmative action policies in the United States has gone into this book. A considerable part of that period has also included the study of similar policies in other countries. An international perspective on group performances and quotas enables us to examine the arguments on both sides of this issue with a much larger and more varied sample of evidence. There are few policies more in need of evidence with which to weigh the heated assertions and counter assertions of advocates and critics. Merely cutting through the jungle of semantics which surrounds controversies over preferential policies in many countries is a formidable challenge. If this book can contribute to clarity on that issue alone, it will have achieved one of its main goals. In the course of gathering material for the study of affirmative action policies under the many different names that these policies have in different countries, I have incurred many debts to scholars, officials, librarians, and others in many lands. Too many people to mention here by name, but I am grateful to them all. My greatest debt, however, is to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, which paid for lengthy and costly international trips to gather the information presented here. As with my other writings over the past 15 years, my research assistant, Na Liu, has contributed not only dedicated efforts but also many insights. Okay, and that's Thomas Sowell, the Hoover Institute, Stanford University. Now, just so we all know where he's coming from, this was written or published anyway in 2004. So, yeah, it's maybe a little dated. Depends on your perspective, but because it was 21 years ago, but I think it's still going to be relevant. So, once again, the title Affirmative Action Around the World, an Empirical Study. Chapter 1, An International Perspective. While controversies rage over affirmative action policies in the United States, few Americans seem to notice the existence or relevance of similar policies in other countries around the world. Instead, the arguments pro and con both tend to invoke history and traditions that are distinctly American. Yet group preferences and quotas have existed in other countries with wholly different histories and traditions, and in some countries such policies have existed much longer than in the United States. What can the experiences of these other countries tell us? Are there common patterns, common rationales, common results, or is the American situation unique? Ironically, a claim or assumption of national uniqueness is one of the most common patterns found in numerous countries where group preferences and quotas have existed under a variety of names. The special situation of the Maoris in New Zealand, Maoris in New Zealand, based on the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, is invoked as passionately in defense of preferential treatment there as the unique position of untouchables in India or of blacks in the United States. Highly disparate rationales have been used in different societies for programs which share very similar features and often lead to very similar results. Some group preferences have existed for minorities, some for majorities, some for the less fortunate, and some for the more fortunate who feel entitled to maintain their existing advantages over other members of the same society. Today, it is programs for the less fortunate which are called affirmative action in the United States, or by such other names as positive discrimination in Britain, and in India, standardization, in Sri Lanka, reflecting the federal character of the country, in Nigeria, and sons of the soil preferences in Malaysia and Indonesia, as well as in some states in India. Group preferences and quotas have also existed in Israel, China, Australia, Brazil, Fiji, Canada, Pakistan, New Zealand, and the Soviet Union and its successor states. Despite how widespread affirmative action programs have become, even the promoters of such programs have seldom been bold enough to proclaim preferences and quotas to be desirable on principle or as permanent features of society. On the contrary, considerable effort has been made to depict such policies as temporary, even when in fact these preferences turn out not only to persist but to grow. The official affirmative action or group preference policies, so I'm sorry, I put a word in there that wasn't there. Official affirmative action or group preference policies must be distinguished from whatever purely subjective preferences or prejudices may exist among individuals and groups. These subjective feelings may, of course, influence policies, but the primary focus here is on concrete government policies and their empirical consequences, not on their rationales, hopes, or promises, though these later considerations will not be wholly ignored. Fundamentally, however, this is a study of what actually happens rather than a philosophical exploration of issues that have been amply, if not more than amply, explored elsewhere. Limited and transient preferences. The resurgence of group preferences in societies committed to the equality of individuals before the law has been accompanied by claims not only that these preferences would be temporary, but also that they would be limited rather than pervasive. That is, these programs would supposedly be limited not only in time but also in scope, with equal treatment policies prevailing outside the limited domain where members of particular groups would be given special help. In India, for example, a government minister urging lower university admission standards for untouchables and members of disadvantaged tribes included the proviso that he was recommending, quote, relaxation for admissions and not for passing or grading, end quote. Just as he was for limiting the scope of preferential treatment, so others were for limiting its duration. As an advocate of reserving certain numbers of jobs for members of specified groups in India said, quote, even the staunchest supporters of reservation acceded that it is a transitory provision, end quote. Sorry. It was the leaders of the untouchables themselves who proposed a 10-year cutoff for reservations in order to forestall political opposition and social conflict. That was in 1949, and the reservations are still in place today. Okay, I think we're supposed to be going into an ad, but it hasn't started yet. Okay, Similar reasoning was applied in the United States to both employment and admissions to colleges and universities. Initially, it was proposed that there would be special outreach efforts to contact minority individuals with information and encouragement to apply for jobs or college admissions in places where they might not have felt welcome before, but with the proviso that they would not be given special preferences throughout the whole subsequent processes of acceptance and advancement. Much the same rationale appeared in Malaysia, and so did the further extension of preferential treatment, which developed despite this rationale. Okay, and here's the rationale. Quote, although grading is supposed to be without reference to ethnicity, all grades must be submitted to an evaluation review committee having heavy Malay representation. Individual faculty members report various instances when grades were unilaterally raised, apparently for purposes of ethnic balance. End quote. Similar policies and results have also been achieved in less blatant ways. During the era of the Soviet Union, professors were pressured to give preferential grading to Central Asian students, and what has been called affirmative grading has also occurred in the United States in order to prevent excessive failure rates among minority students admitted under lower academic standards. In India, such practices have been referred to as grace marks. Similar results can be achieved indirectly by providing ethnic studies courses that give easy grades and attract disproportionately the members of one ethnic group. This, too, is not peculiar to the United States. They are Maori studies programs in New Zealand and special studies for Malays in Singapore. In the job market as well, the belief that special concerns for particular groups could be confined to an initial stage proved untenable in practice. Initially, the term affirmative action arose in the United States from an executive order by President John F. Kennedy, who called for affirmative action to ensure that the applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to race, color, creed, or national origin. End quote. Um, in short, there were to be no preferences or quotas at all, just a special concern to make sure that those who had been discriminated against in the past would no longer be discriminated against in the future, and that concrete steps would be taken so that all and sundry would be made aware of this. However, just as academic preferences initially limited in scope continued to expand, so did the concept of affirmative action in the job market. A later executive order by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968 contained the fateful expressions goals and timetables and representation. These were not yet full-blown quotas, for the 1968 guidelines referred to goals and timetables for the prompt achievement of full and equal employment opportunity, quote unquote. Still later, another executive order in 1970 by President Richard Nixon spoke of, quote, results-oriented procedures, end quote. And finally, in December 1971, yet another Nixon executive order specified that goals and timetables, quote unquote, were meant to, quote, increase materially the utilization of minorities and women, end quote, and underutilization, quote unquote, being spelled out as, quote, having fewer minorities or women in a particular job classification than would reasonably be expected by their availability, end quote. Affirmative action was now a numerical concept which called goals or whether called goals or quotas. In a very different society and governmental system halfway around the world, in Pakistan, attempts to confine affirmative action policies within their initial limits proved equally futile. Here, preferential policies began in 1949 as an explicitly temporary measure to be phased out in 5 to 10 years. The principal beneficiaries were to be the very poor Bengalis of East Pakistan, who were, quote unquote underrepresented in business, the professions, and the military, while even the administration of East Pakistan was largely in the hands of West Pakistanis. However, the preferential policies continued decades past the initially specified cutoff time by repeated extensions. Even after East Pakistan seceded to become the independent nation of Bangladesh in 1971, the preferential policies in Pakistan had sufficient other political constituencies to continue on after their principal initial intended beneficiaries were gone. Britain's Lord Scarman expressed a view widely held by those initiating affirmative action in many countries when he said, quote, "We can and for the present must accept the loading of the law in favor of one group at the expense of others, defending it as a temporary expedient in the balancing process which has to be undertaken when and where there is social and economic inequality." End quote. This confident pronouncement, however, presupposed a degree of control which has proved illusory in country after country. Moreover, quote, "when and where there is economic inequality," end quote, encompasses virtually the entire world and virtually the entire history of the human race. A temporary program to eliminate a centuries-old condition is almost a contradiction in terms. Equally, equality of opportunity might be achieved within some feasible span of time, but that is wholly different from eliminating inequalities of results. Even an approximate equality of representation, quote unquote, of different groups in different occupations, institutions, or income levels has been a very rare or non existent phenomenon, except where such numerical results have been imposed artificially by quotas. As a massive scholarly study of ethnic groups around the world put it when discussing, quote, proportional representation, end quote, of ethnic groups, quote, "few, if any, societies have ever approximated this description," end quote. Another international study of multi-ethnic societies referred to, quote, "the universality of ethnic inequality," end quote, and pointed out that these inequalities are multidimensional. Okay, a longer quote now. Quote, "all multi-ethnic societies exhibit a tendency for ethnic groups to engage in different occupations, have different levels and often types of education, receive different incomes, and occupy a different place in the social hierarchy," end quote. A worldwide study of military forces likewise concluded that, quote, "militaries fall far short of mirroring even roughly the multi-ethnic societies," end quote, "from which they come. At one time, nearly half the pilots in the Malaysian Air Force came from the Chinese minority. In Tsarist Russia, 40% of the Army's high command came from the German ethnic minority that was only 1% of the country's population. Similar gross disparities in ethnic representation in occupations, industries, and institutions can be found in country after country around the world and in century after century. Often those overrepresented in high-level occupations have been minorities with no power to exclude others, but simply possessing particular skills. Germans, for example, have predominated among those who created the leading beer companies in the United States, as they created China's famous Tsingtao beer and established breweries in Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and other countries. Similarly, Jews have predominated in the manufacturing of clothing in medieval Spain, the Ottoman Empire, Argentina, the United States, and other countries. In short, the even representation of groups that is taken as a norm is difficult or impossible to find anywhere, while the uneven representation that is regarded as a special deviation to be corrected is pervasive across the most disparate societies. People differ and have for centuries. It is hard to imagine how they could not differ given the enormous range of differing historical, cultural, geographic, demographic, and other factors shaping the particular skills, habits, and attitudes of different groups. Any temporary policy whose duration is defined by the goal of achieving something that has never been achieved before anywhere in the world could more fittingly be characterized as eternal. And just as a little side note, I remember watching a clip of Jordan Peterson where he talked about um, one of the Scandinavian countries, I forget which one, Netherlands maybe, um, where they have gone the farthest toward absolute equality between men and women, not even talking about ethnicities, but just between men and women. And they are the most open to anybody being able to do any job. And they have moved farther apart as far as the women have gone towards very traditional female roles, secretaries and nurses and that sort of thing, and the men migrated more towards the very traditional male roles as far as work, and yet they have every opportunity to do the opposite, but they don't. They have actually moved farther. They've polarized even more. Anyway, um, you should look up his talk on that. Okay, preferred and non-preferred groups. Just as we cannot presuppose continuing control over the scope and duration of preferential policies, so we cannot simply assume what will actually happen to those designated as the preferred group or groups. Neither they nor the non-preferred groups are inert blocks of wood to be moved here and there according to someone else's grand design. Both confront laws and policies as incentives and constraints, not as predestination, and react in their own ways. These reactions include redesignating themselves, altering their own efforts and attitudes towards achievement, and altering their attitude towards members of other groups. Designation and redesignation. One of the reactions of members of non-preferred groups has been to get themselves redesignated as members of the preferred group. This can be done either individually or collectively. Some individuals of mixed ancestry have been regarded and self-identified as members of Group A, may choose to redesignate, or who have been regarded and self-identified as members of Group A, may choose to redesignate themselves as members of Group B when Group B is entitled to preferential treatment and members of Group A are not. In the United States, during the Jim Crow era, some light-skinned blacks simply passed as white in order to escape the legal and social disadvantages that went with being designated black. Later, during the era of affirmative action, whites with traces of American Indian or other minority ancestry likewise redesignated themselves in order to take advantage of preferential policies for disadvantaged groups, like Pocahontas. These have included, that's my addition, of course, these have included blonde-haired and blue-eyed individuals with official papers showing some distant ancestry of another race. The number of individuals identifying themselves as American Indians in the U.S. Census during the affirmative action era rose at a rate exceeding anyone's estimates of the biological growth of this population. Moreover, a breakdown of census data by age cohort shows that the number of American Indians increased over time in the same age cohort, a biological impossibility made possible on paper by redesignations of the same individuals. For example, the number of American Indians who were aged 15 to 19 in 1960 was just under 50,000. But 20 years later, when these same individuals would be in the age bracket 35 to 39 years old, there were more than 80,000 American Indians in that cohort. In other words, more than 30,000 people in the same cohort who had not designated themselves as American Indians in 1960 now did so in 1980, causing more than a 60% increase in the number of American Indians in that cohort. A similar pattern emerged among the Aborigines in Australia. A study in that country found that there was quote a 42% increase in the size of the Aboriginal population between the 1981 and the 1986 censuses. End quote. Virtually a demographic impossibility in 5 years, except by redesignation of the same individuals with different ethnic labels. As an Australian scholar has noted, quote, the dramatic increase in numbers has much to do with record keeping, increasing intermarriage, and the growing availability of substantial subsidies to people of Aboriginal descent. The definition of Aboriginal includes many persons of predominantly non-Aboriginal descent who might, with equal or greater genetic justification, designate themselves as non-Aborigines. End quote. It was much the same story in China, where in the 1990s more than 10 million Chinese proclaimed their ethnic minority status in order to gain preferential treatment, such as college admissions. Even China's draconian restrictions on having more than one child did not apply to ethnic minorities as they did to the majority Han Chinese. Quote, Article 44 states that, in accordance with legal stipulations, autonomous areas can work out their own family planning measures. As a result, urban minority couples generally may have 2 children, while urban Han are restricted to 1. Rural minorities may have 2, 3, 4, or even more children, depending on their ethnicity and location. End quote. An official of China's State Nationality Affairs Committee commented, quote, some people would try all means to change their nationality because they wanted to make themselves eligible to enter a university with lower scores or to stand a better chance than their colleagues when it comes to promotion, end quote. As in other countries, people with mixed ancestry had the option of choosing how to designate themselves. Some, quote, traced their ancestry back hundreds of years to prove minority blood, end quote, and claim the benefits. Another individual response to preferential policies has been to use someone genuinely of the qualifying ancestry as a front for businesses seeking preferential treatment in the awarding of government contracts or other desired benefits. This practice has been so widespread in both Indonesia and Malaysia that it has acquired a name, Alibaba Enterprises, where Ali is the indigenous individual who ostensibly owns the business and is legally entitled to government benefits, while Baba is the non-indigenous person, usually Chinese in these countries, who actually controls the enterprise and essentially pays Ali for the use of his name and ancestry. Similar arrangements have been uncovered in the United States and elsewhere. Anti-Semitic policies in Poland during the years between the 2 world wars likewise led some Jewish businesses there to operate behind Gentile frontmen. Decades later, or Gentile. I said genteel. Sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Gentile frontmen. Decades later, under preferential policies in Kenya, Africans served as fronts for Asian-owned businesses, as they likewise served as fronts for Lebanese-owned businesses in Sierra Leone. Members of some Members of some non-preferred groups can also get themselves redesignated collectively. The 14th Amendment to India's Constitution, like the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, provides for equal treatment of individuals, but India's Constitution provides explicit exceptions for benefits to the untouchables, disadvantaged tribal groups outside the Hindu caste system, and quote-unquote other background classes. This last proviso especially has created opportunities for many other groups to get themselves collectively designated as being among the other backward classes. Eventually, this miscellaneous classification provided more individuals with the coveted rights to preferential treatment than were provided to the members of the untouchable and tribal groups for whom the preferences were created. In 1997, organized efforts were also begun to seek preferential treatment for India's 15 million eunuchs, though obviously they were not the descendants of other eunuchs and so could not inherit historic group disadvantages. Redesignations of individuals and groups, like the spread of preferences from given groups to other groups, take preferential policies further and further away from the initial rationales in which they were based. No historic sufferings of blacks in the United States can justify preferential benefits to white women or to recently arrived immigrants from Asia or Latin America who happen to be non-white, but whose ancestors never ah man, but whose ancestries obviously never suffered any discrimination in the United States. Similarly, the painful history and continuing oppression of untouchables in India can hardly justify preferential benefits to local majorities in particular states such as Assam, Maharashtra, and Andhra Pradesh. Yet, these local majorities and members of other backward classes, quote unquote, outnumber the untouchables and are often in a better position to take advantage of the preferences. Thus, quotas for government jobs or university admissions have often remained unfilled by untouchables, while this has seldom been the case for members of the other backward classes, quote unquote. The spread of benefits from group to group not only dilutes those benefits, especially when more than half the population of the country becomes entitled to them, as in both India and the United States. It can also make the initial beneficiaries worse off after the terms of the competition are altered. For example, in the United States, where hiring and promotions decisions are subject to review by government agencies investigating discrimination, objective criteria may be used increasingly by employers for legal self-protection, even if the relevance of this criteria to the job is questionable. If these criteria are met more often by one of the preferred groups than by another, if white women have college degrees more often than black men, for example, then one preferred group may be no better off on net balance than if the preferences did not exist. It is conceivable that they can be worse off. Such a situation is not peculiar to the United States. An official report in India in 1980 noted that the advancement of one preferred group tended to push back another, creating, quote, greater tension between structural neighbors in this hierarchy than between the top level and the bottom level, end quote. That continued to be so in the 1990s, with violent clashes in several Indian states being found to be more common among competing poorer groups than between these groups and the more elite castes. In 2001, a rally was held in the state of Rajasthan protesting the inclusion of new groups among the backward classes and demanding, quote, separate fixed quotas for original backwards, end quote, so that new entrants, quote unquote, would not be able to reduce the existing benefits enjoyed by those for whom the preferences were created. Calls have been made for a, quote unquote, that was weird to say, a quota within quota, within quota, to deal with such situations. Insofar as affirmative action policies are aimed particularly at offsetting existing economic disadvantages, their rationale is undermined when the benefits of these policies go disproportionately to those individuals within the designated groups who are the least disadvantaged, or perhaps are in more favorable positions than members of the country's general population. In India's state of Tamil Nadu, for example, the highest of the so-called backward classes, quote unquote, legally entitled to preferences constituting 11% of the total backward classes population in that state, received almost half of all jobs and university admissions set aside for these classes. In Malaysia, where there are preferences for the indigenous sons of the soil, quote unquote, majority Malay students whose families were in the top 17% of the income distribution received just over half of all the scholarships awarded to Malays. In Sri Lanka, preferential university admissions for people from backward regions of the country appear likewise to have benefited primarily students from affluent families in those regions. This should hardly be surprising, nor is it necessarily a matter of corruption. Preferential access to education or jobs is just one factor in getting the education or the job. Obviously, those people who have more of the other factors required are better able to turn preferential access into actual success. Pre-existing prosperity provides more of those other factors. Those American minority business owners who participate in the preferential program called business set-asides under Section 8, subsection A of the Small Business Act average a personal net worth that is not only higher than the average net worth of the groups they come from, but also higher than the average personal net worth of Americans in general. A scholarly study of group preferences in India pointed out that preferences that benefit more fortunate members of less fortunate groups, quote, borrow legitimacy from the national commitment to ameliorate the condition of the lowest, end quote, while at the same time, quote, they undermine that commitment by broadcasting a picture of unrestrained preference for those who are not distinctly worse off than non-beneficiaries, end quote. Just as specifying the scope and duration of affirmative action policies has proven illusory, so has the designation of the beneficiaries in accordance with the rationales of these policies. Both attempts suffer from assuming far more comprehensive knowledge and control than anyone has been able to exercise in any of the countries in which preferential programs have been instituted. What has also been overestimated is the extent to which the attitudes resulting from such programs can be assumed to be beneficial to the groups concerned or to the country at large. These attitudes tend to respond to initiatives rather than to rationales. Incentives. Both preferred and non-preferred groups have modified their own behavior and attitudes in response to preferential policies and the rationales for such policies, while members of the officially preferred groups who already have the complementary factors needed to take the fullest advantage of preferences can do so. Those who lack these factors often feel less incentive to acquire them, now that entitlements are available as substitutes for achievements. The development of job skills, for example, may be de-emphasized. As a leader in a campaign for preferential policies in India's state of Hyderabad put it, quote, are we not entitled to jobs just because we are not as qualified? End quote. A Nigerian likewise wrote of, quote unquote, the tyranny of skills. That's kind of what we're getting into now in the U.S. Math is white supremacist. Being on time is white supremacist. You know, things like that. It's just like, what? The tyranny of skills? Anyway, moving on. In Malaysia, where group preferences exist for the majority population, quote, Malay students who sense that their future is assured feel less pressure to perform, end quote. In the United States, a study of black colleges found that even those of their students who were planning to continue on to postgraduate studies showed little concern about needing to be prepared, quote, because they believed that certain rules would simply be set aside for them, end quote. Both preferred and non-preferred groups can slacken their efforts. The former become because working to their fullest capacity is unnecessary, and the latter because working to their fullest capacity can prove to be futile. After Jamaica gained its independence from British rule, many whites living there no longer bothered to compete for public office because they, quote, felt that the day of the black man had come and questioned why they had to make the effort if the coveted job or the national honor would go to the blacks despite their qualifications, end quote. While affirmative action policies are often thought of by advocates and critics alike as a transfer of benefits from one group to another, there can also be net losses of benefits when both groups do less than their best. What might otherwise be a zero-sum game can thus become a negative-sum game. In some countries, complete physical withdrawal from the country by those in non-preferred groups has occurred in the wake of preferential policies which reduced their prospects. The exodus of Chinese from Malaysia, Indians from Fiji, Russians from Central Asia, Jews from much of pre-war Europe, and I've never seen this word before in my life. I'm going to butcher it. Huguenots? Huguenots? Huguenots. I'm going to say Huguenots from 17th century France in response to discrimination drained all these countries of much needed skills and talents. In short, preferential policies represent not simply a transfer of benefits from one group to another, but can also represent a net loss, as both groups respond by contributing less than they could to the society as a whole. Not all incentives are economic or even tangible. Honors are among the most powerful of incentives in many situations, especially where dangers and death must be faced, and where money is less effective than a sense of honor, as in the military. In less dire circumstances as well, honor and the respect of peers play important roles, not only as rewards for achievements, but also as factors helping to make individual achievements possible in the first place. The cooperation and collaboration of colleagues can be important in a variety of occupations, from scholars to policemen, and that cooperation and collaboration can be compromised by group preferences. For example, minority professors on American campuses have complained that being thought of as affirmative action professors by their colleagues has led to less intellectual and research interaction, which in turn reduces the minority faculty's development as scholars. These can be a serious handicap in achieving one's potential. In life and death situations such as those faced by the police, firefighters, and soldiers, mutual confidence is even more important. Yet black police sergeants promoted in Chicago over white policemen with higher test scores as a result of a court order found themselves taunted as quota sergeants when they made mistakes. Intergroup relations. Even aside from losses to the economy as a whole because of disincentives created for both preferred and non-preferred groups, there are social losses due to intergroup resentments, which can be even more serious. Nor are these resentments due simply to the transfers of benefits. When a particular political backlash against affirmative action began in the United States, many in the media were quick to characterize it dismissively as due to quote unquote angry white males, resentful of the loss of various benefits to blacks and other minorities. In other words, just an emotional reaction by people irked at losing a few of their many advantages. But this resentment was by no means proportional to intergroup transfers of benefits, or it would have been far greater against Asian Americans who displaced more whites in prestigious universities and in many high-level professions, especially in science and technology. At many of the leading universities in the United States, whites lost, quote unquote, more places to Asian Americans than to blacks, and yet there was seldom any backlash against Asian Americans. The outstanding academic and other achievements of Asian Americans were widely recognized and widely respected. It was not the intergroup transfer of benefits that was resented, but the basis for those transfers. Yes, because Asians are held to an even higher standard in general. Among Americans, especially, the idea that some are to be treated as more equal than others, quote unquote, is galling. It was this feeling in the general population which leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s were able to mobilize behind their efforts to destroy the Jim Crow laws of the South, so that a majority of the members in both houses of Congress from both political parties voted for the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was this same American resentment of special privilege which responded so strongly to the historical words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 that his dream was of a country where people would be judged, quote, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, end quote. It was after the civil rights movement itself began to move away from this concept of equal treatment of all individuals and toward the concept of equalized outcomes for groups that a backlash against affirmative action set in and grew over the years, and rightfully so. Yet there is, sorry, yet there is yet another sense in which resentments against preferences for other groups are not proportional to the benefits transferred. An observer of preferential policies in India noted the disproportionate resentment of places reserved for scheduled castes, quote unquote, the official euphemism for untouchables. Quote, we hear innumerable tales of persons being deprived of appointments in favor of people who ranked lower than they did in the relevant examinations. No doubt this does happen, but if all these people were in fact paying the price for appointments to scheduled castes, there would be many more SC persons appointed than there actually are. To illustrate, supposing that 300 people qualify for 10 posts available, the top 9 are appointed on merit, but the 10th is reserved, so that the authorities go down the list to find an SC applicant. They find one at 140 and he is appointed, whereupon all 131 between him and the merit list feel aggrieved. He has not taken 131 posts, he has taken one, yet 131 people believe they have paid the price for it. Moreover, the remaining 159 often also resent the situation, believing that their chances were somehow lessened by the existence of SC reservations. End quote. In the United States as well, those who resent group preferences may be some multiple of those who have in fact actually lost anything that they would have had in the absence of these preferences. In the 1978 landmark Supreme Court challenge to affirmative action brought by Alan Bake, a white student denied admission to a University of California medical school, neither side to the dispute could state with confidence that Bake would or would not have been admitted in the absence of the affirmative action policies which admitted minority students with lower academic qualifications than his. The admission process was sufficiently complicated that it was not clear whether some other white or Asian American student might have been admitted instead of Bake. I assume that's Bake, B-A-K-K-E, whatever. In other words, it was not certain that Bake had in fact lost anything as a result of affirmative action, and yet his sense of being wronged was sufficient for him to pursue the case all the way up to the highest court in the land. One of the things that prevents affirmative action from being a zero-sum process is that minor transfers of benefits can cause major resentments among far more people than those who have actually lost anything. Moreover, these resentments do not end with political or legal actions. In India, where preferential policies have a longer history than in the United States, they have also had more bitter consequences. 42 people died in riots over places reserved for untouchables in a medical school in the state of Gujarat. Just 7 places. This was part of a national trend of rising violence against untouchables amid adverse reactions against preferential policies in general. Meanwhile, less than 5% of the medical school places reserved for untouchables in Gujarat had actually been filled over a period of years. Studies of university admissions in general in various parts of India showed a similar pattern of many places reserved for untouchables going unfilled. Nevertheless, minor transfers of benefits led to major resentments, including resentments erupting repeatedly into lethal violence. Nowhere has this resentment led to more violence than in India's neighboring nation of Sri Lanka, which has been racked by decades of civil war, in which the non-preferred groups, the Tamils, have sought to secede and become an independent nation. This tragic story will be left for Chapter 4. Here it is sufficient to mention, among other examples of intergroup polarization brought on by affirmative action. It is clear that affirmative action in Sri Lanka has not been a zero-sum process. The material, political, economic, and social havoc created by that country's long civil war has undoubtedly left all segments of the population worse off than they would have been in the absence of group preferences and the reactions to which these preferences led. Trends. Even where there are adequate statistical data on the progress of groups that have been given preferential treatment, and often there are not, it remains a challenge to determine how much of that progress was due to preferential policies rather than to other factors at work at the same time. Simple before and after comparisons will not do, as that would be assuming that nothing else had changed, when in fact the very dynamics of establishing affirmative action programs often reflect changes that were already underway before group preferences began. Seldom is there a stationary situation to which a given change, quote unquote, is added. Often it was precisely the rise of newly educated and upwardly mobile groups which led to demands for preferential policies. A study in Bombay, for example, found a, quote, marked advancement of the Maharashtrians occurred prior to the stringent policy measures adopted by the state government, end quote, to promote preferential hiring of indigenous Maharashtrians. In part, this reflected a prior, quote, enormous growth in school enrollment in Maharashtra, end quote, and a, quote, rapid expansion in college enrollment, end quote, also prior to preferences. In Malaysia as well, the number of children attending the government's secondary schools increased by 73% in just 5 years immediately preceding the new economic policy, which expanded preferences and quotas for Malays. In Sri Lanka, likewise, there was a, quote, rapid expansion of educational opportunities in the Sinhalese areas, end quote, after independence and before demands for preferential treatment of the Sinhalese. A similar growth of an indigenous newly educated class in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Lithuania during the years between the two world wars led to demands for preferential policies in the form of group quotas in order to relieve them from having to compete on an equal plane with Jews who were already educated, experienced, and established in the positions to which the newly educated classes were aspiring. Likewise, in Nigeria, it was the recent growth of an educated class in the north that led to demands for preferential policies to relieve them from having to compete with southern Nigerians who had predominated in universities and in many desirable occupations. This same pattern of a rising educated class prior to the preferential policies that they promoted can also be found in Indonesia, the Quebec province of Canada, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. In the United States, the proportion of the black population going to college doubled in the 2 decades preceding the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, and this was reflected in the occupational rise of blacks. While it is an often cited fact that the proportion of blacks in professional and other high-level occupations rose substantially in the years following passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, It is an almost totally ignored fact that the proportion of blacks in such occupations rose even more substantially in the years preceding passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Dramatic progress was also evident during these same decades in the lower socioeconomic levels of the American black population. The percentage of black families with incomes below the official poverty line fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% by 1960. All of this before the civil rights legislation of that decade, much less the affirmative action policies of the 1970s. Between 1960 and 1970, the poverty rate among black families dropped an additional 17 percentage points, and after the decade of the 1970s in which affirmative action was established, the poverty rate among blacks fell one additional percentage point. So it didn't gain them much. This striking difference between the political myth and the economic reality has many implications. Among them is that what might otherwise be seen as a remarkable achievement by black Americans is instead seen as an example of government beneficence and largesse, and a reason why affirmative action is an absolute necessity for black advancement. The effects of this misperception include white resentments and their questioning why blacks cannot advance themselves like other groups, when in fact that is what most blacks have done. Incidentally, it is an equally ignored fact that the incomes of Asian Americans and Mexican Americans also rose substantially, both absolutely and relative to that of the general population, in the years preceding passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its evolution into preferential policies. Any assessment of preferential policies must take account of pre-existing trends rather than assume a static world to which change was added. Summary and implications. Despite the highly varied rationales for official group preferences and quotas in particular countries around the world, the logic of their incentives and constraints tends to produce similar consequences in very disparate societies. Moreover, both the incentives and the consequences tend to get ignored in political discussions of these policies, which focus on their justifications and presumed benefits while ignoring actual empirical results. In the United States, mythical results, affirmative action, as the basis for the economic rise of blacks, for example, have so completely supplanted facts that few who discuss this policy find it necessary to check historical evidence at all. For some supporters of affirmative action, it is just a matter of being in favor of helping the less fortunate, with the details being left for others to consider and work out. However, even a broad brush look at what affirmative action programs have actually done in various countries reveals that a failure to achieve their goals may be the least of the problems created by these programs. Poisonous intergroup relations and real dangers to the fabric of society have also been produced by affirmative action in some countries. That would become painfully clear when we, or that should become painfully clear when we look at the details in the chapters that follow. And that is the end of chapter 1. What do you think so far? Interesting. I didn't even know that there were all these affirmative action things going on in different countries. Um, it does make some sense, especially the one that I hadn't actually thought of, but when the officially by law, but not necessarily in practice, did away with the caste system in India. Like I said, not in practice, but technically by law, they did away with it. But I never really thought that they would implement an affirmative action policy. It just never even occurred to me. But anyway, that is it for this reading. I am not going to read any more tonight. Do I want to raid? No, I really don't. So we'll just call it there, and I will see you in the next reading, which will probably be Friday for this book again. So I will see you then. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not lights like I had, but more sophisticated sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not like I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but it's over now. Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes. Wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not my talk I've had, but more sophisticated into love